Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for this event on Unequal Profession. I am Sarah Levine, Editor-in-Chief of the Southwestern Law Review. On behalf of the Law Review, I want to extend our gratitude to everyone here for attending this important discussion this afternoon. We are truly thrilled to be hosting this meaningful event. This webinar grew out of a symposium centered on themes that arise in Professor Meera E's book, Unequal Profession. Laura will put this book information in the chat for you all if you would like to read it. All of the speakers here today contributed essays that will be published in the 51st volume of the Southwestern Law Review. We are thankful to each of our speakers who will be sharing their scholarship and insights with us today. Additionally, thank you to Professor Meera E, who allowed us to build this symposium on her book, Unequal Profession. We are excited to delve into your work today. Next, we are so grateful to our Law Review faculty advisor, Professor Danielle Hart, who brought this opportunity to the Law Review. Also, thank you to Southwestern Law School for your support of this webinar and of the Law Review. Lastly, thank you to our wonderful special projects editor, Laura Hartman, who organized this webinar and will be moderating with me today. Finally, before we introduce our speakers, Lily from Southwestern's office will be informing those seeking CLE credit how to obtain it. So Lily, please go ahead and give out that information.
Thanks, Sarah. Everyone who's looking for continuing legal education credit, we are offering that for this program. It's going to be in the form of a link that I will share at the end. So I will make another little announcement at the end of the program. And if you just fill out the link, I will send you a certificate and the materials on Monday. Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you so much. Laura and I will now introduce our speakers. First, we have Ederlina Ko joining us today. Professor Ko is an associate professor of law in the McGeorge School of Law at University of the Pacific. Professor Ko has extensive experience in both the public and private sectors. She clerked for the Honorable Dale A. Drozd at the U.S. District Court for the Eastern District of California, served as counsel at NARAL Pro-Choice America, where she led NARAL's proactive policy efforts to reduce racial and ethnic disparities in reproductive health care. Professor Ko received the Julie A. Davies Professor of the Year Award for 2020. Her research is focused on reproductive rights and justice. Next is Danielle M. Conway, who is the Dean and Donald J. Farage Professor of Law at Penn State Dickinson Law. A leading expert in procurement law, entrepreneurship, and intellectual property law, Dean Conway previously served as Dean of the University of Maine School of Law. She is the author or editor of 6 books and casebooks, as well as numerous other publications. Her scholarly agenda has focused on advocating for public education and for actualizing the rights of marginalized groups, including Indigenous peoples and minoritized people. She is also a recipient of the inaugural AALS Impact Award for her path-breaking work with 4 other Black women deans, spearheading the Law Deans Anti-Racist Clearinghouse Project. Deshaun Harris is also joining us in this discussion today. Professor Harris is an assistant clinical professor of law and director of bar preparation in the Cecil C. Humphreys School of Law at the University of Memphis. Prior to joining Memphis, Professor Harris was director of the Academic Success and Bar Services program at Texas A&M University School of Law. Professor Harris's research and teaching interests include educational psychology, assessment, and critical race theory. Next is Daryl D. Jackson, who is the director of the Prosecution Assistance Program and professor of law at University of Wyoming College of Law. Professor Jackson's experience includes serving as assistant dean in law, practicing law as an assistant United States attorney in the District of Columbia, and serving as a judicial law clerk to the Honorable L.M. Brinken-Ma in the U.S. District Court for the Eastern District of Virginia, and to the Honorable Marcus D. Williams in the 19th Judicial Circuit of Virginia. His research interests surround supporting historically marginalized communities as they struggle to obtain an equitable share of power within truly democratic societies. And now Laura will introduce our remaining panelists.
Thank you, Sarah. Next, we are so lucky to have Dean Kevin R. Johnson, Dean and Maybe Apollos Professor of Public Interest Law and Chicano Studies at UC Davis School of Law. Dean Johnson has published extensively on immigration law and civil rights. His latest book, Immigration Law and the U.S.-Mexico Border, received the Latino Literacy Now's International Latino Book Awards Best Reference Book. He has held leadership positions in the Association of American Law Schools and is the recipient of an array of honors and awards. Dean Johnson blogs at Immigration Prof and is a regular contributor on immigration on SCOTUS blog. Additionally, he is well known for scholarship and advocacy focused on increasing diversity in legal academia. I would also like to introduce Susan Westerberg Prager. Professor Prager served as Southwestern's 11th Dean and President from 2013 to 2021. She was the first woman in the history of our law school to serve as Dean. She previously was Executive Director and Chief Executive Officer of the Association of American Law Schools, Provost of Dartmouth College, President of Occidental College, and Dean of UCLA School of Law, a post she held for 16 years. When she became Dean at UCLA in 1982, she was 39 years old and had been a member of the faculty for a decade. She was one of only 2 women law deans at ABA schools at the time. Next up, we have Shruti Rana, Assistant Dean and Professor of International Law and the 2020 Wells Program Class of 1963 Professor at Hamilton Lugar School of Global and International Studies at Indiana University, Bloomington. Dean Rana serves as the diversity officer for her school, as well as director of the International Law and Institutions Degree Program, a joint endeavor with the Moore School of Law. She has a broad range of leadership and other experience in academia, legal practice, and international human rights organizations, including as a social affairs officer at the United Nations, where she worked on international women's human rights issues and treaties. She has recently testified before legislators in Indiana and New York on reproductive rights laws, including the impact of proposed legislation on AAPI women. Dean Rana has been an advocate for greater diversity, equity, and inclusion in legal academia, including as a principal organizer of the COVID Care Crisis in Legal Academia Symposium, hosted at Indiana University in January of 2021. Next, it is my pleasure to introduce Lua Kamal Ewell, Professor of Law and Business in the School of Law and the D'Amore McKim School of Business at Northeastern University. Professor Ewell is an interdisciplinary scholar whose current work engages property theory, business law, heterodox economics, critical pedagogy, and group identity. Her recent projects include studies of the economics and pedagogy of street gang identity and control mechanisms, corporate personality, and contemporary private property. We are so lucky to have all of you.
Yes, and we also want to express our gratitude to the scholars submitting essays to the Unequal Profession Paper Symposium, but who are unable to join us today for this webinar. Dean Erwin Chemerinsky from Berkeley Law, who is contributing to the foreword to this symposium, Professor Angelique Eaglewoman of Mitchell Hamlin School of Law, and Professor Saira Chaudhry from Florida International University Law. We know we have so much to learn from their insights and hope you will join us in reading their essays when the symposium is published this spring 2022. Finally, it is my great pleasure to introduce Professor Meera Deo. We are here to celebrate and discuss Professor Meera E. Deo's book, Unequal Profession, Race and Gender in Legal Academia, which examines how the intersection of race times gender affects faculty experiences. Meera E. Deo is director of the Law School Survey of Student Engagement, or LESI, and professor of law at Southwestern Law School. After practicing civil rights and public interest law, she earned a PhD in sociology. Last year, she was the Newcomb Fellows Research Chair in Diversity and Law at the American Bar Foundation. Professor Deo's research merges jurisprudence with empirical methods to interrogate institutional diversity, affirmative action, and racial representation. She has received support from the National Science Foundation, Paul and Daisy Soros Fellowship, Axis Lex, Walters Kluwer, and others. Professor Deo is also a member of the American Law Institute. Now, please welcome Professor Deo, who will share some thoughts on her research and her book.
Thank you so much for that introduction. It is a tremendous pleasure to be here today for this Unequal Profession Symposium. When I started working on this project years ago, I never imagined a group of superstars like those who are joining me here today at this event would convene to share their insights and experiences and observations on some of the book's central themes and findings. I want to thank the Southwestern Law Review faculty advisor, Professor Danny Key Hart, who reached out to me about organizing this event over a year ago, even before she invited me to apply for a lateral faculty position at Southwestern. And a huge thank you to Sarah Levine and Laura Hartman, the Law Review students who have been the principal organizers of this symposium, as well as the leadership at Southwestern, Dean Darby Dickerson, and the team of people involved in putting this event together. And of course, thanks to all of you for attending. So when I first entered law teaching 13 years ago, I realized there was little diversity among faculty, even less than among the student body. I looked into the statistics and I found that only 7% of all law professors are women of color, while roughly 62% are men and at least 71% are white. Surprisingly, at the time, nobody had really studied those disparities. And since I had been conducting empirical research on legal education already by then for quite some time, I decided to expand my focus from students to study the even less examined and less diverse domain of legal academia. Unequal Profession draws from my diversity in legal academia study, which is the first comprehensive empirical study of law faculty, using an intersectional lens to investigate the personal and professional lives of law faculty at all stages of the career. I interviewed and collected survey data from 63 women of color as the core sample for my study, as well as comparison groups of 30 men who are 30 men, white women, and men of color. So why women of color as the focus? Intersectionality recognizes the whole person, that all of us are made up of more than just one single identity. So someone who identifies as Black may also identify as a woman, as wealthy, as a lesbian, as a mother, professor, as a lover of yoga. If there were no hierarchies based on difference, then identity characteristics might not affect long-term outcomes. But because there are preferences that are based on race, gender, class, and other identity markers, each of these serve as opportunities for oppression. Thus, women of color who operate at least two sites of devaluation based on race as well as gender manage bias and discrimination that differs from those facing even men of color or white women. Unequal Profession makes clear that in spite of some similarities, the experiences of women of color do differ from others. Women of color are more likely to get pushback from students in the classroom who may expect a white male professor and are surprised and even sometimes dismayed to see a woman of color behind the podium instead. The rates of tenure and promotion are lower for women of color faculty than for others, both because of bias in teaching evaluations, as well as because scholarship focused on identity, family, and other non-traditional areas is often disfavored. My study also reveals significant gender bias experienced by white women and women of color alike. Almost every woman in my book notes the mansplaining and he-peating that happens in faculty meetings. So what do I mean by that? Here's an example from Carla, a Latina in my sample, who says, quote, "I've counted over 10 times on my faculty where I've said something and nobody has responded. Then a male faculty has repeated it and another male colleague has said, good idea." Women are also overloaded by service, from student meetings to university committees, community events, and even taking notes at faculty meetings. This uncompensated labor takes time away from scholarship, which is what most schools value most for tenure and advancement. Being the default parent, carrying the mental load and engaging in day-to-day household management, as well as the long-term needs of immediate and extended family, most of us struggle with work-life balance as well. The book shares a number of individual strategies that faculty members have utilized to overcome many of these barriers. For example, many faculty cite preparation as a key to their success, not just preparing for class by mastering the material, but also crafting a classroom persona, oozing authority and competence. Some draw external validation from their elite law school credentials and former big law practice to highlight to students how valuable they are. Of course, we also need structural solutions to overcome these systemic barriers. Utilizing only the traditional hiring process is, for example, a missed opportunity to make real change. Instead, just as one example, one school hired a woman of color they met at a local happy hour for intellectual property lawyers. She had never considered law teaching, but they met her on her own turf, convinced her to apply, and now she is a thriving member of their team. Another school used to have faculty meetings at 4 p.m., though many women faculty have left campus by then to shuttle kids around to activities before logging back in late at night. Changing their meetings to noon meant that women could actually attend these meetings in larger numbers and have a voice. I want to end by highlighting that these past 18 months have seen unprecedented challenges in legal education as a whole, for faculty, students, administrators, staff, really for all of us. In academic year 2020 to 2021, I collected new data from law faculty to document their experiences under COVID through my Pandemic Effects on Legal Academia study. My preliminary findings are bleak, as you might imagine. The challenges I share in Unequal Profession provide a baseline, though they have been exacerbated significantly due to COVID. Service duties have exploded as women faculty have done even more to cater to the needs of students. Women are teaching torts to their law students, but also doubling as elementary school teachers for kids who stayed home all year. What we've been doing is simply unsustainable, but it also creates an opportunity for transformation in legal education. How can we envision legal academia to be more diverse, more equitable, more inclusive? What structures can we put in place to support faculty who are underrepresented? Let's talk more about ways to lift one another up so that vulnerable faculty members can share their voices too. So for these reasons and so many more, I am so excited to listen and learn from all of you today. Thank you again for joining us, and I look forward to the rest of our time together today as well as into the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Dale. And now let's get into our discussion. This first portion will be between the moderators and panelists, but if you do have a question for our panel, we will have time at the end and we encourage questions from the audience. You will see that there's a Q&A and chat features below, so you can choose whether to send your question to everyone as a whole or just to the panelists and moderators privately. Our first question for our panel is, what are some of the particular challenges associated with women of color taking on leadership roles in legal academia? And whoever wants to field this question first, please chime in.
I'll identify two very quickly and then cede the floor. But thank you first for having this conversation and for uplifting the work of Professor Meera E by having this symposium. Well done. First, I'd say that Professor Deo outlined for us that the sheer numbers, having 7% women of color, that creates the first and probably most challenging barrier. And so to have a sense of not seeing oneself in the leadership role provides an obstacle to that kind of presence on the stage of leader. The second, and I think a little more nuanced, is this idea of having women of color in proximity to centers of power. And let me lay this out so that others hopefully can either add to it or examine it further. When I talk about centers of power and being in proximity to those centers, it's being able to first be selected for the leadership role, but second, to be supported in the leadership role, to be able to leverage professional development opportunities in moving from the prospective candidate to the actual leader, and having people support and sponsor that kind of transformation from operationalist as a law faculty member to leader. And then next is the ability to use these sponsors to access networks that help you secure the influence of the constituencies who you must rely upon to amplify both your leadership and amplify your vision for the law school, the university, or the board that you must lead. And so this proximity or center of power is critical, because that really depends on your ability to have people there with you, supporting you.
Thank you. And I'd like to jump in and follow that great opening. But first, also say thank you so much to Professor Deo and also the Southwestern Law Review for putting this together. To go further into some of the themes you just heard, I think that some of the most insurmountable barriers to overcome are stereotypes and people's conceptions about who looks like a leader, like you just heard from Dean Conway, independent of qualifications, of course. So to name just a few, there's presumed incompetence, right? The title of an important book on the subject, pet to threat syndrome, the burdens of simultaneous invisibility and visibility, where perceived flaws are magnified and talents are diminished or portrayed as weaknesses. And I think that the impact of these conceptions is that to obtain a position or maintain one once you've obtained it, is that women of color in leadership positions have to display a hyper competence and political skills that are at levels far above the bar of what is seen as acceptable in other candidates. And I think in terms of measuring success, the reality is that it's often difficult to measure and convey success in leadership in concrete terms to different audiences in the academy. So we see that women of color are more likely to rise and fall with their institution as opposed to in relation to their own particular skills or accomplishments. And I think they're also, as we all know, more likely to enter into positions of power when institutions are failing and they might be left holding the bag. So these dynamics are exacerbated, I think, because leadership positions are often precarious and public facing in ways that traditional faculty or tenured positions are not. And so that means it's difficult sometimes to gain experience outside of trial by fire, but you're not offered the opportunity to learn from your mistakes. It's one shot and you're done often. So I think that ultimately all of this has cumulative impacts. You have greater stress, greater uncertainty, greater precarity, greater strife in interpersonal interactions, and fewer cushions to learn and grow on the job. And I think Professor Deo really evocatively captures in her book, this means that there's a high human cost for each achievement, for every woman in a leadership role. So I think our broader challenge is to figure out ways to address these challenges so that when we see women of color in leadership roles, we're not just seeing the survivors of trial by fire or the ones who haven't made their, first mistake yet, but that we can actually move to the stage of building a deep bench and a critical mass in this area. So thank you.
And I want to amplify Professor Rana's thoughts about the precarity of leadership positions and Dean Conway's thoughts about how we get there. Malcolm X talked about the position in which Black people find themselves and called it a triple trap. And I think this is particularly real for women of color looking and seeking positions of leadership because we're not seen as leaders typically. And then we get a particular problem, which is as women, if we talk about how great we are, right, we are seen as somehow less than women, right? That is not okay. Women in at least our cultural spaces are asked to be submissive, to be self-deprecating, to not say, I'm amazing, right? But then we've got a different problem, right? So like white women are trained to just say it, go ahead, tout your awesomeness, right? And that's how you get through it, which is problematic and terrible. But as women of color, we've got an additional problem, which is this. When people of color, and there's like research that shows this, when we say self-deprecating things about ourselves, we're believed. So if I say I'm stupid, you believe it. If I say I can't do it, you believe it. So if I say I'm amazing, you think I'm the B word or I'm terrible or whatever bad things because I'm a woman. And if I do what women are supposed to do, then you actually believe that I'm incompetent, right? So your instinct to think that I can't do it, to exclude me from the networks, to not convert me into the leadership role is then borne out by evidence. Because whatever comes out of my mouth, you get those biases, the global you of the world, you get those biases confirmed, right? So it's a triple trap. I have taken the approach that, I'd rather you think that I'm a jerk than you think that I'm stupid. But I get terrible feedback about being haughty, about thinking I'm too big for my britches, thinking she's somebody. Well, but if I say I'm stupid, then you're like, Professor Yule's a dummy, so she can't do it. And I've had that experience, and I have to decide which trap am I going to navigate. And then we have this problem of precarity. Not only are we typically given the job that nobody wants in the worst moment, right? We get to lead the sinking ship, right? But even when ostensibly we're not given the worst job, we are really given the most precarious tasks. We're asked to say the dangerous thing. So I spent last year, and this is not just in the law school context, right? Many of us sit in institutional contexts that have a law school in a greater institution. So I spent the last academic year as the faculty senate president on my institution, and anybody who has seen me in the last year knows that I talk about this all the time because it was really illuminating. But one of the things that I couldn't believe was how much time I spent in meetings having to say the terrible thing. So you want to get your TMI moment, and then I'll be quiet. We were, at the beginning of last year, I was in a geographical context that meant we had to go back to school in person a full year before many of you went back to school in person. So we were thinking about what is the scope of safety mechanism, right? And so we're sitting on a meeting and we get the little checklist of health things, right? And the checklist of health things is like, do you have a headache? Do you have aches and pains? Do you have cramps that you didn't have yesterday? And I chose that in particular because I'm sitting there and I'm looking around and I'm like, is no one going to say this out loud? Is no one going to say this terrible thing with the head of the university, with the boss of bosses, with the state regulators on the line? Everybody is Okay, so we're going to have a little testing mechanism and everybody's going to certify every day. And so who has to raise their hand and say, the symptoms that you have just described, because it's still relatively early in COVID, right? We don't have massive testing the way we do today that's accessible, and particularly not in my state. So I'm like, I have to raise my hand and say, you've just described the symptoms associated with menstruation. And so a huge population of your students, staff, and faculty, once a month, will have several days of not being able to honestly answer those questions if you want them to come to work. Do you want us to, and then what happens if you say, no, you got to call your doctor? Am I supposed to call my doctor every time I have my period? And then like negotiate through having a period with my doctor? And the whole room gets quiet and uncomfortable. And I'm like, yeah, I had to say it. Meanwhile, right, we're on Zoom. In my private messages, in my DM, thank you so much for saying it. I was thinking that. So you put the Black lady out there to talk about menstruation when we know, not that it should be, but that's the taboo topic. And I'm like, every single day, I have to say the terrible things. Even, right, I go in a room with a team of people, right? And I'm the person who had to look in the face of the head of the university and say, this is ridiculous, this is unsafe. While sitting next to me is a very senior named professor who's famous. And then I get a DM from that person sitting next to me in the next screen, right? Because it's Zoom time, right? Thank you so much for saying that. Everyone was thinking it. And I'm like, but I have to take the heat. So not only are we given the precarious jobs, but we're given the precarious tasks, the dangerous tasks. And then when we say this stuff, rather than people actually giving us the high fives, thank you, I was thinking that as well, they stay silent. And so then we are the people who turn everything into our own personal pet projects that aren't universalizable, right? They're not universal. There are little petty things. Oh, Lua has periods. And so Lua is just thinking about her. When like, again, not everybody has them, but a lot of people do on any given campus. Or Lua has kids, or Lua is concerned about her health. And it's a personal thing because the experience of women of color isn't the experience of humans, isn't the experience of people. And so I think that that is another huge, huge complication because we're not believed, but we're forced to do the work. And then we're forced to do the precarious work. That was long and that was ranty, but that's how I'm feeling today.
And Lua, I wanted to just add that because people figured out that you would do that hard work, that fed into people would just sit back and think, oh, Lua's going to take care of this for us.
Yes, and I'll add one other note, and I think this kind of gets to some of the points that were previously made, is that when you're in the position, there are two things that also occur. There's like what was just described, sort of this hyper visibility, right? So you're the one that is making the call. You're the one that is the face of diversity. They may even put you in the publication so that everyone can see it. But then there's this other side, right? When you actually start to do the work where there's an invisibility piece. This idea that some people may try to co-opt the things that you're doing, particularly if you're sort of at that mid-level. So you're a director and then maybe there's a dean ahead of you. Then someone may co-opt the things that you're doing so that you're not actually getting the credit. The other thing that sometimes comes with sort of this invisibility is that when people have an issue with the things that you're trying to implement, is that they don't see you as a person, and so they may go above you. So, you know, instead of reports that will come to you as the director of whatever, they're going directly to your dean. Or if you're the dean, they're going to the provost. And so I think there's something to be said that when you're in these positions, that it goes back to what Professor or Dean Conway said is the support aspect. Who are those people who are going to be allies and supporters so that they can offshoot those people who are undermining the efforts that you are making, the students who are going above you and telling them, actually, you need to go back and talk to this director about this as opposed to just taking that up in tow. And so I think it's important that when we think about these leadership positions that we're given enough support and that we're thinking about, okay, yeah, we're making them very visible. Are we giving them the benefit of the doubt here? Or are we supporting their efforts as well? And are we highlighting the work that is being done?
Okay, all very good points from our panel already. I would say we're off to a great start. I'm already learning so much. The next question that we have for the panelists is, well, first of all, Southwestern is known for being a home to a lot of law students that traditionally maybe wouldn't have had the opportunity to go to law school. So the question is, do you find any parallels in the experience that both non-traditional law faculty and non-traditional law students share?
I'd like to take that on for a little bit. I think that Meera's book highlights some of the ways that we can help students of color as well as professors of color, in the sense that there really is a lack of mentorship for many non-traditional law students and law faculty. And many of them, us, come to legal academia without the social capital and knowledge of how to navigate very basic things like the ALS Faculty Recruitment Conference, or how to give a job talk, or even knowing you have to give a job talk, and don't have the resources to be able to take a low-paying fellowship to get those tips that many candidates get on the market. So I think that law schools could do much to try to figure out how to mentor people of color, women of color, especially when they're there and they've been hired in the building. And I think there are a variety of sort of mentoring programs that create pipelines for faculty of color that we should support as well. And so I think that those are important things. I do not think that many law schools, I know we could do better, pay as much attention to mentoring women of color who are professors. There's some work, there's some structures in place, but more work could be done. And I think historically there is virtually no mentorship given to students of color and students for low SES backgrounds. There was little academic support given to any students for a large chunk of time. I remember when I was in law school, the only academic we got was a keg in the courtyard on Friday afternoon. No tutoring, no counseling, no office hours. It was a very different time, and I'm glad we're not living in that time. But I know that some law schools, and we're one of them, are coming up with mentorship programs that are focused on law students generally, but also first generation law students in particular, with a faculty mentor for each student. And I think, giving conscious intention to efforts to mentor students, as opposed to just saying we should mentor students, is a good way to approach things. One of the wonderful things I find working at an institution with about 60% students of color and 30% students from low-income backgrounds is that there are mentorship possibilities, and you can really make a difference in students' lives. And I know I do, and I know many of our colleagues find that particularly fulfilling. And we probably should be spending more time focusing on mentorship generally for students as well as for faculty.
I'll jump on Dean Johnson's bandwagon about the mentorship. I will say just real briefly, thank you, Professor Deo. Thank you to the Southwestern Law Review for putting this on. The book is amazing, and I'm sure we'll finish talking about that throughout the entire course of the day. But to the Southwestern Law Review, I know what a massive task this was to organize, both as a journal as well as an event. So thank you for all the work and time that I know you had to put into creating this. To answer your question, do I see any parallels? The answer is yes. Unquestionably yes. And I think the parallel statement that kind of binds the two for me is, you do not belong here. That's what students see. That's what the faculty see, the faculty we're talking about see. You do not belong here. Yes, we've let you in the door, but you do not belong here. Professor Deo was as I reviewed my highlights of the book this morning before coming on today, Professor Deo was very clear about it on like page 1X of her forward, where she says the racial and gender inequality I remembered as a law student exists in parallel forms among the faculty, right? She saw it right away and she lets us all know. And she says it on the next page, I have come to realize the parallel experiences of marginalized students and faculty. She made it quite clear that this is a task that the law schools have to take up, because she's not going to leave it for them to imply. She's going to be very explicit about the fact that, yeah, these things exist blatantly in the institution that is the law school. And one of the forms that we see it, and I'm just giving one example right now, and I saw it again last night when I came out of a meeting with an alum. We came out and he was looking for a picture of somebody. Well, pictures are a great example. Walk through the vast majority of law schools and look at whose pictures are on the wall, right? That's heroism. Those are modern day statues, right? We're giving homage to those personalities. And if you look at those pictures, who's there? Who's not there? And if you're not there, you don't belong here. You might be in the building, but look on the walls. You just don't belong. And so I appreciated how Professor Deo labeled it for faculty. And I'm especially energized by seeing her work, because I did a book a while back called Black Men in Law School, and it's almost the same type of work that Professor Deo did. It was a qualitative review looking at a mixed methods approach of law and qualitative assessment, and looking at this thing from just what you'd asked, the student's perspective. And I wanted the readers to digest this idea of how the institution is the problem, not the students, not this whole Bakke, all the cases that we have coming out of Texas. They're not the problem. The institution is the problem. And until we are willing to grapple with that as an institution, we're destined to repeat history. And I don't need to get into the quotes about repeating history.
So I want to get really specific about the things that Dean Johnson and Professor Jackson are talking about. And I want you guys to think wherever you are, think about the institutional space that you're embedded in, whether you're in a law school, are you in practice already, wherever you are. And one of the things that I do is property. And so I think about space and place and physical space and place. And I get in a lot of trouble at my institution when I talk about this, but think about walking around your space, right? At my institution, the name of the building is just on one side. And so you only even know what building you're at for any given building if you're already in front of it and already knew you were there. There aren't signs on campus on how to get where, and they can be big, sprawling campuses. Or once you get in the building, it might be a maze and you don't know, and they might, somebody gave money to name the library, and so it says the John R. Franklin room, and that's the library, and you're like, but I don't know who John R. Franklin is, right? So when we talk about these messages of exclusion, right, it's that there's a map and a language and a culture, and for many people, they've been learning that language. They've been trained in those languages, or they have the translation book. And students of color, students from low SEX backgrounds, students who are first generation students don't necessarily have that book. So when we talk about mentorship, we're talking about folks who may or may not know the rules of the game. And even someone like me, who I am not a first generation college graduate, right? I was very, very well trained in the rules of the game, but there was another set of rules that I still didn't have access to. And it wasn't until someone decided to sit me down and talk about the non-meritocracy rules did I actually get access to the next level. So when Dean Johnson talks about mentorship, it's not what you hear about generally. It's a deep, specific level, because even folks from higher SES backgrounds, socioeconomic status backgrounds, right, might not have all of the rules of the game, because the game is played on lots of levels. And when you don't sit us down and talk to us about those rules, you are telling us we don't belong. But I think that there's another thing, and we fall into that triple trap right here, because we allow people and we take on identities that I think allow institutions to not take the responsibility for sharing the rules of the game. For example, I remember sitting in a meeting, and I know that lots of people who are sitting here today have done this, and people are like, oh, I'm a diverse student. Stop, hold up. I'm not diverse. I am not diverse. What does it mean? We're lawyers. There's a lot of lawyers in this space. I'm not diverse. It's impossible for me to be diverse. I contribute diversity, maybe, right? I am in predominantly white institutions, so I contribute diversity to predominantly white institutions, but I'm not diverse in and of myself. I might have intersecting identities, but I'm not diverse, right? But we allow ourselves to be permanently otherized in a way that allows the institution to act like there's nothing that they can do to create a space in which I belong. I even think that's true when we call people non-traditional students. That is normatively suggesting that the people who have historically been included in the law school enterprise, they're the ones who should be there. And the people who have historically been excluded, not historically, contemporarily are excluded by things like LSAT, by things like an unequal pipeline for higher education, are somehow interlopers. My brother, who has a PhD in education, calls students who are from historically marginalized communities students of the vanguard, because he says it's fine to say that we're the early enterers. But don't suggest that what was passed is normatively right. Don't say that I am different in a normative way. I am different, but you need to take responsibility. The reason I contribute diversity is because your institution is too white. The reason that I don't know the rules of the game is that I've been historically excluded. And so when Professor Jackson talks about markers of inclusion, and when Dean Johnson talks about mentorship, it's at a level of specificity that I don't think institutionally we've caught up with, because it's real and it's specific and it's minute, down to the pictures on the wall, down to the cases you're assigning, down to the authors that we read, and down to the people we bring into our spaces. And so these are big things that they're saying. Even though it sounds like stuff we've heard before, they're giving us big responsibilities and big tasks, and I think we need to appreciate that.
Thank you so much for sharing your personal experiences. I can tell by the people posting in the chat that everyone is really enjoying the insights everyone is sharing so far. So our next question is, how have hierarchies within legal academia shaped your experience? And can you speak to some specific challenges that have been particularly burdensome?
So I will jump in here. First, let me say a brief thank you to Laura and Sarah for organizing this wonderful event, and my deepest gratitude to Professor Meera E for her leadership and all of her work in this area. So as Professor Deo and all of the panelists have alluded to, legal academia has adopted so many of American social hierarchies, especially as they relate to race and gender. And maybe that's not surprising, because legal academia is a microcosm of American society, but all of these hierarchies have impacted my experience in one way or another. And so when you think about the hierarchies in legal academia, they're most obvious in representation and law school climate and in status, right? When it comes to underrepresentation, you look at the vast majority of law schools and women of color remain underrepresented. If you look at law school climate, Unequal Profession does a brilliant job of laying out the intersectional barriers that many women of color face and that prevent them from maximizing their success, whether it's race, gender stereotypes, presumptions of incompetence, bias, etc. And then finally, maybe the least obvious to anybody who's outside of legal academia is the deep-seated hierarchy and the differential treatment that occurs between professors who primarily teach doctrinal classes and have tenure, and professors who teach skills classes and are on contracts, either multi-year contracts or single-year contracts, which provides another challenge for women of color in these positions because they have limited job security, they are paid less, and they are excluded from full citizenship at most institutions. And so for this particular symposium, what I decided to focus on was invisible labor, which is a byproduct of underrepresentation, of law school climate, and to some extent, status. And so when I talk about invisible labor as a form of hierarchy and something that I have faced and every woman of color I know has faced, what I'm referring to is the steady, if not overwhelming service that women of color professors provide to students as role models, as mentors, as surrogate parents. Although many professors will engage in mentoring of students, what I'm talking about with respect to invisible labor has to do with not just mentoring about lawyering, but mentoring about thriving in their environment, as well as simply surviving. And so let me be clear when I say that invisible labor is a labor of love for many women of color professors. It's one of the reasons I love my job. The concern or the problem with invisible labor isn't the invisible labor so much as it is the legal academy's unwillingness to recognize it as meaningful work. Naturally, students are going to seek out women of color professors because they are more accessible, they are more available, they are more willing to serve as mentors compared to their white professor colleagues. But because of their numeric underrepresentation, there are fewer women of color professors who students can go to build these relationships and to access for advice and counsel. And the result is that women of color professors bear the brunt of this work. And so bearing the brunt of this work has both professional costs in terms of taking time away that professors need to be doing scholarship with, need to be preparing for class or teaching, but it also has personal costs. When institutions and the academy are not crediting invisible labor as meaningful work, that is marginalizing. And so the legal academy's unwillingness to recognize invisible labor not only devalues women of color professors, it also devalues and disregards how important that work is for law students, for law schools, and for the legal profession more broadly, in addition to continuing to perpetuate a race-gender bias. So I will cede the floor there. Thank you.
And so if I can add very quickly, my experience with sort of hierarchy in legal education has been such that it becomes very obvious in this context that there are two things that are being conveyed. One is whose work is important and what work is important, which is what Edelina is getting to with sort of what work is important. But the who part also is something that is concerning. And oftentimes we tend to think about it in the dynamics of sort of tenured and untenured, but there's a subcategory of that as well, which is non-teaching specific folks who are in the classroom but have titles that may be staff. And I say that because I've been doing academic support and bar support since 2011, and each and every position that I've had doing that has had a classroom component, but it is not until now that my title actually says professor. And so there's something to be said that legal education actually has to do more about the sort of teaching roles. Particularly, we can't continue to look at just tenure and untenure. What about our staff? That's a place where a lot of women are also employed. And we also sometimes think about, sometimes librarians are fitting into that category, academic support. We may not even think about it at some schools. Career services is doing some teaching when they're talking about sort of professionalism. And when we continue to expand sort of diversity, where do those folks fit? And so when we talk about sort of these hierarchies, we can't continue to confine ourselves to just professors. We also need to think about teaching generally. And what does that mean when we talk about pay dynamics? What does that mean in terms of sort of the turnover we sometimes see in law schools with staff, particularly when law schools are suffering from tremendous financial strains? What does that look like? Because more likely than not, what it looks like is that we continue to maintain our professors, we continue to try to get our student enrollment up, but we may be letting go our staff. And what does that mean is that we're getting less service. And so Edelina was talking about sort of this invisible labor. When we talk about service, we may be missing an opportunity for innovation. Because when we talk about service, these are the folks that are going to be looking at the COVID adjustments. These are the folks who are going to be looking at the bar exam and what does that mean for our curriculum when it makes those changes. These are the folks that are going to be looking at mental health gaps. These are the folks who are going to be looking at cultural competence, which the ABA is now saying that we also have to incur. And so there's a big question about who's doing that work, not just for professors, but also the staff members in our building. And how can we better situate service in such a way that it becomes comparable to things like research and teaching, because it's an incredible opportunity for us to innovate. But if we're continuing to stick to sort of these guidelines with teaching, which is, or sorry, with research, which is often sort of the male associated part of our profession, then we may be missing opportunities to actually move the needle forward. And I'll leave you with this. The reason why I say we may be missing opportunities with innovation and not looking at service more productively and actually putting money ties to it and that kind of thing is that I remember reading a few weeks ago about how the innovation of wheels on the suitcase was delayed for about 50 years or so because carrying your luggage was considered to be macho. And so it wasn't until men started thinking about sort of the wheels on the suitcase. Women were already doing this because they were finding ways to kind of lug things along very easily. But that innovation didn't come along until men started to find this to be a problem. And so the question for legal education is, what problems are women solving now that aren't pushing the needle forward? I can give you a few, like assessment practices. The cultural competence is usually coming from women. We're talking about clinics. And so there are lots of places where we could have profound changes in legal education that are stifled. And part of that is because of these hierarchies.
And I am not going to disturb that fabulous path that Professors Coe and Harris laid out because it was sheer perfection. But here's what I'm going to say is that think about now the number of women law deans of color and think about their understanding implicitly of this race times gender discrimination. And I'd say that in the group that we have, we understand implicitly and explicitly the inequity in status, in respect, in the positions, in the pay. And I can tell you that it's so interesting being a dean because I see it and I know it and I respond to it. And what I get from my staff, what I get from my faculty are thanks, because this is the first time anybody has ever addressed it, acknowledged it, called it out, and then laid out a plan to be responsive to it. And that just, it makes my heart hurt on so many levels, because at the same time, as many of my co-panelists have said, at the same time when we are acknowledging this and doing something about it, we're also suffering this hyper-competitive engagement in the legal academy and in legal education, buying faculty for purposes of US News and World Report status, when we should be thinking, how do we make this and demonstrate with our actions? How do we demonstrate equity instead of these very toxic approaches to measuring the value of a legal education? And that's what's very disturbing. And when we talk about, how our experiences in the legal academy are shaped by these hierarchies, we see the hierarchy and we know exactly how we got to this place in legal education. But again, nobody wants to acknowledge that legal history of exclusion, that legal history of feeding the machine of the large law firm, of the types of privileges to those who are beneficiaries of the white hierarchy going to those firms And then when we start to admit women, we start to bring in students of color into the legal education enterprise, how all of a sudden, like we were talking about with Professor Ewell, the whole map changes, the whole rule structure changes on these students, on these prospective new faculty, on the new leaders of law schools. The rules now are changing. And the last thing I'll say about that is, you know, when you have women of color who are ascending to leadership roles now, and they see this inequity and they get on the role of acting to do something about it, guess what happens at many a university? All of a sudden, the leader's wings are clipped. The leader has the university paying hyper attention to what she is doing. And I'm not saying I'm doing good here, I'm okay here, but I'm saying, you know, the royal institution. So don't worry about me, I'm all right. But this is happening at a lot of schools where there's a hyper focus on the administration and the management of that new leader.
All right, and that brings us to our next question, which is, how does unequal profession fit into recent and ongoing race times gender changes that we're seeing in academia and society at large? And in case any of our audience members are not familiar with the term race times gender, it refers to the effect of holding multiple devalued identity characteristics. And it's built on the idea of intersectionality by emphasizing the compound effect that the two characteristics have on each other. So again, the question is, how does equal profession fit into recent and ongoing race times gender changes that we're seeing in academia today and in society at large?
I think that Meera Deo's book is a stark and refreshing reminder of all the work that we have to do and we should be doing, and many schools are trying to do, but we probably aren't doing enough. And I want to commend her for being our conscience in this way and making us face the facts and the data. I think that all schools, including my school, need to work harder at attracting women of color as well as people of color generally to hire on faculties. And I think that you have to think sequentially about identifying candidates, attracting candidates, and retaining candidates, which all require separate and different kinds of approaches and tacts. You know, many times law faculties, and note that I'm pointing the finger at faculties, not deans here. Many times law faculties will say, you know, we need a very specific curricular fit, that we need a law and economics PhD with a focus on corporate governance. And that pool is going to be about 1% people of color. If I were to write the definition, the class job description, it might be something like criminal law with an interest in racial and social justice. And I'd get a 50% diversity in the pool, I bet. But I think it's critically important that you identify what you're looking for, and the fewer constraints, the better. But law faculties are notorious for wanting narrower job curricular fit types of faculty. When it comes to attracting faculty, one of the things that we should all pay attention to is it's very difficult to attract diverse faculty to a non-diverse faculty. It's much easier to attract a diverse faculty when you have one. So success breeds success. And people look at that in the process. So they're looking at an all-white faculty, and I'll get to me looking at one in a minute. It tells you a lot. And then retention, you know, you end up hiring somebody. It's not just that you should be throwing them to the wolves. It should be having structures in place that support them through the tenure process, and structures that are independent of the humans involved. Although it is important to remember that at every stage of this process, it is people who are implementing these policies under structures, and that people trust people or not trust people And that trust is critically important to the entire process, or the lack of trust also affects that entire process. Now, here we've enjoyed a bit of success. When I joined the faculty, it was a long time ago, but it was 0% faculty of color. There were no faculty of color at UC Davis School of Law, which is in a building named after Dr. King. And it took a generation, but now we have a majority minority faculty. And it wasn't me, but it was another dean, Rex Perschbacher, I'll name him, who took some concrete structural steps that helped change the things and get people thinking about changes. One is a continued drumbeat talking about the interrelationship between diversity and excellence, and how you couldn't be a great law school if you're an all-white law school, especially in the late 20th, early 21st century. That took some time, but planted a seed. And then always ensuring that you have a diverse appointments committee. It's amazing how closely that faculty interviewing in the recruitment process look at the people they meet and what it tells them about the school. And you need a appointments committee committed to diversity and hard at work to achieve that goal. The last thing, and this is one that I'll say a little softer since I'm in my law school right now, we more or less put the appointments committee in receivership with the dean and the associate dean serving on every appointments committee since I became associate dean in 1998, so that we could ensure that we always had a diverse pool of applicants who were considered, that the shortlist included diversity, because you're never going to hire a diverse applicant if you've got an all-white pool that you're pulling from, and to make sure that people understood some of the biases in their job description or the perfect candidate description. Some folks would say that we really need more Supreme Court clerks. Well, that really changes the diversity of the pool. There's probably fewer than 5 Mexican Americans who ever clerked for a Supreme Court justice. One is the dean at Stanford, and there's a few others, but not many. I remember one time in a faculty meeting, and a person will go unnamed, saying that we need a intellectual property person with a focus on technology. The kind of person has a pocket protector in the top pocket. Well, who do you think has a pocket protector? What gender is more likely to have a pocket protector than not? I don't think that person was evil or bad, but he didn't understand that his sort of perfect applicant might have gender consequences on the pool. But I think that there has to be structural changes to the way we approach appointments, and I think that Unequal Profession reminds us of all the pitfalls in the entire process that we should be paying attention to. Some of them I knew and were intuitive to me, and I often make fun of empiricists for providing data and stuff I already know. But there are other things that I didn't know that I learned from and I appreciated.
So I do want to say that Kevin is being modest in his factual description, because Rex Perschbacher, who did make a huge difference, made that difference in significant part because he made Kevin his number 2. And the rest is history. They both worked hard, and it's an amazing story to me because I am so old that I know the Davis faculty from the very beginning because it was formed while I was in school and growing up in Northern California. I knew about this law school, and it had one thing that was unusual, and that was there was a female first faculty member at Davis, but the rest of it was pretty boring, to be blunt. And these 2 men really changed the course of the history of the school so dramatically. It's an amazing story to me. So Meera, you need to correct me if I have the timing wrong, but I think this question of what what the moment in time that your work comes along in is quite important. I think all of your interviews and data collection occurred before George Floyd's murder, but the book comes out actually after or close in time to it. And I think for that reason, there has been much more of a sense of urgency in our institutions about bringing about change. And you have provided this devastating picture of what a huge proportion of our faculty of color, and particularly women of color, are experiencing. And what they're experiencing is resonating with a lot of white women. So there's this combination of factors that now creates a momentum and an opportunity. And I think without your work, we wouldn't have this ability to say, look, guys, if you doubt what we're saying, take a look at these interviews and what people are saying they're experiencing. I think the other thing that's happened to me is really astonishing. Look at what has happened with the deanship with respect to Black women. I'm sorry, I need to look at these numbers because I did not memorize them. At the beginning of the 1920 school year, it looks to me as if there were 14 Black women who were deans. Now that is a big number, historically speaking. So the rise in this number started, but now that number, which includes one or two interims, is now 27. This in and of itself, despite what's been described about the impediments to any dean making change, let alone a Black woman who's going to have a number of these insights and want to do something about them. This is powerful. This is not going to be trivial. It is making a difference. It's being noticed, and so many of you are so fabulous, and I'm looking at Danielle as I'm speaking, and there will be more. So I want to speak to those faculty who are listening to this program and say a couple of things. Don't assume that your dean knows things that you think are obvious, because 9 times out of 10, the dean doesn't know them. So you need to find a way, if you're not comfortable, find a way to get information to your dean, even if it means somebody at another institution tells your dean. If you're in one of these toxic places, which that was the most depressing thing to me about reading Meera's work, and she describes, really two worlds, I think. And my sense from talking to her individually is the unattractive world is the very dominant one in terms of the numbers, and that is the inhospitable climate for women of color and probably for faculty of color in general. So making change is going to be important, but it's really important that we seize this moment and try to drive that change forward. And no dean can do that, no matter what their race or perspective is, unless they know what's going on. And it's not easy as a dean to find out, because people don't want to be the one telling the dean things the dean might prefer not to be hearing. The other thing I would say is that deans have to embrace the idea that part of our job is to chill certain speech and behavior, something that we don't think is a good thing in general in law because of what we think about in the context of constitutional law and basic fairness. But in my experience, if ugly things happen in a faculty meeting or a committee meeting, people's memories are so long, they never forget them. It's very hard to wash these things out. So we need to be saying in our faculty communities, we need for you all to be professional. We're trying to teach our students to be professional. You need to be professional. You need to be modeling what we're saying we're doing, or at least some of us are saying we're doing with our students. And the third thing I would say is that we have to change the demographic of the hiring patterns. When the ALS recruitment conference was created, it was created because the first woman president of the ALS, distinguished scholar named Soya Menchikov, wanted to turn the annual meeting into a scholarly meeting like other disciplines had. And what was happening is the annual meeting was a place where male faculty, because there were virtually only male faculty at this time, I'm talking the mid-70s, there were very few female faculty, would bring their proteges to the annual meeting and try to introduce them to their friends who would gather together little informal groups, and they would interview these people at the annual meeting. And that's how the faculty perpetuated itself. So perhaps she wasn't as conscious of this, but what happened when the registry basically said to anyone who wanted to apply, come one, come all. And it's true that, you know, now today things have gotten so much in emphasizing already produced scholarship, it's narrowed again. But for quite a while, there was opportunity and there was a lot of hiring of women and people of color beginning to go on. And we have to figure out how to get back to that kind of climate. It is not a good thing that most of the law faculty went to Harvard or Yale. Think about what most of our institutions' missions are, where our graduates are going. We should have people committed to teaching and research and hopefully service, at least for those who are good at it. We need them for our faculty, but that the pool is too narrow if we are drawing primarily from two of the very few super elite law schools in the country, because their own law school experience doesn't prepare them for the kind of emphasis that many of our schools have. So I think that the other thing I would say is that all deans, no matter what their own background, need to have the latitude to recognize that not every faculty member is good at service, but that those who are good at it and disproportionately get it need to get a break in one or another or both of those other categories, or their lives just become more and more untenable, which is another of the really devastating things that Meera's book makes clear. So I'm going to stop with that.
Thank you so much. So we've been discussing some changes that schools are currently taking. And Dean Johnson, you mentioned some changes that you have implemented while making appointments. But besides representation and hiring, what structural steps towards solutions could administrators and others be thinking about? And also to weave in a question from the audience, because I know we're a little short on time for a Q&A. what can schools change about institutional student programs, such as law reviews, to be more inclusive of students of color?
So since I opened the can of worms on invisible labor earlier, let me see if I can try and close it in terms of different structural steps or solutions that law school administrators can be thinking of. The most modest step, of course, is to actually just recognize it as meaningful work. That can come in the form of annual reports, performance evaluations, in a way that invisible labor can count towards increases in salary, bonuses, other forms of compensation. I think another way to address invisible labor is to actually create a committee, a standing committee, the same way you have a curriculum committee or an admissions committee or a disciplinary committee. And what that does is it allows for professors who are engaged in this work to then come together as a network and come up with ways that are supportive of the institution and the common issues that these professors are seeing with respect to students. I think regardless of whether or not administrators choose to recognize this work through committee structure or through performance evaluations, administrators should be mindful about how they are asking professors to account for this work. I don't think that it should involve professors billing each individual invisible labor interaction. That not only is going to pose problems for confidentiality, but it also implies a level of distrust of the professors who are engaged in this work. So when we ask professors to account for their work regarding their scholarship or their teaching, we don't ask for professors to give us every detail. We trust and we put value into that work. And it's the same with respect to invisible labor. And the other thing I'll say is, I think it's time that we as the Academy begin to think about service a bit differently. If in addition to improving numerical representation, we want to improve the climate of law schools, it's time to rethink how we deal with service, right? An individual professor or dean acknowledging invisible labor, for example, that's necessary, but it's not sufficient. And so the Legal Academy needs to address structural biases with structural solutions. So to start, law school administrators should be encouraging their faculty to be self-educating on invisible labor and service in general, that these are not race and gender neutral when it comes to this type of work. And although many faculty members identify as allies, the point of allyship is not simply to allow women of color professors to enter the space, but really the point is to make space for them to credit their work and to actually value the unique contribution that they offer. And so when you think about the three-legged stool that professors are judged on, scholarship, teaching, and service, when service is so diminished, that creates different rules for women of color professors. In addition, when we devalue service, that's wildly inconsistent with the purpose and the point of the legal profession and its commitment to service. So I think big picture, it is time that we begin to re-examine how it is that we value service in general.
So I heartily agree with both the statements that you made and how eloquently I think you kind of noted how we have to value service and other types of invisible labor. And I want to just add a couple of big picture things and then move to a specific one, which is, we need to move beyond the idea, I think, that showing people the ropes is going to create more than superficial change, right? Because how far can you get by explaining the rules to people when the rules are stacked against them? The second thing is, earlier I suggested that one of the key obstacles that women of color face in terms of leadership roles is the need to balance people's conceptions and stereotypes. And I think actually one of the keys to structural change is addressing these narratives, because the narratives that we have exist for specific reasons. One of the key reasons is that false narratives and conceptions obscure the reality of discrimination against marginalized law faculty, and they allow the academy to blame individuals for their own marginalization and ignore and allow decision makers to ignore the systemic forces at work. So it's a dynamic of placing blame on individuals as they leak out of pipelines, as opposed to the gatekeepers who are blocking or forcing them out and perpetuating invisibility and exclusion. And so a third thing, I just wanted to draw on what Professors Jackson and Ewell were saying about things like the meaning of a building, and just give you an example of how hard structural change is and some of the ways we might address it. So at my campus, I naively joined the renaming task force, thinking that, we could get rid of the deeply racist, the names, that referred to slaveholders and active eugenicists, because it was embarrassing to walk in those buildings, right? Much less, I understand what it means to walk into a building and see a representation of yourself, because that's been a meaningful thing for me when I was a student. And I thought that you document how terrible this person was, and then you paint over the sign and keep going. But instead, what you have is a multi-year process where every, eugenicist statement has to be carefully documented by historians, and you have to go through multi-levels of review, and people will fight you at every stage of that process for something that is so silly, right? So I thought, it would be easier for me to go into a courtroom and change my own name than it would be to take the name of an active slaveholder and eugenicist off the building. And so I'm really proud that when we had the opportunity to do this, I probably shouldn't say this, but when we had the opportunity to do this, we just put up new signs overnight and changed the name of our building, and that was that. And, and all that energy and time that we saved were put towards other things, and we could move forward with a symbol that wasn't embarrassing, a symbol that inspired us and made us proud to walk into the building. I just wanted to give that little example of how hard it is to battle the structures that we have, and just sometimes, I don't know if we can just wipe them away. But I think some of these things, like recognizing and rewarding value, addressing stereotypes, they'll take us a long way towards addressing imbalances and exploitation, but at the same time, they're going to benefit students, faculty, and staff at the law schools as a whole. So if we can look at it that way.
So I just want to be a little more blatant about things, because I completely agree, and I'm actually going to incorporate what Professor Rana just said. But to answer the question, what can administrators and others do? To be absolutely blatant about it, look at the data and then act. And I can't emphasize the part "and then act" enough. Professor Deo talked about it a little bit at the very beginning of her introduction, and we've heard a couple people talk about it as we went on. But the idea of action is, I think, where the problem comes. I often talk to my class using sports metaphors, because my life as a football player across all levels. And I always remind them that one of the biggest things about being a football player is you got to know the playbook, right? If you get a playbook, you got to memorize, you got to understand it, you got to implement it. Well, Professor Deo has given us a playbook, right? She's given us a playbook for faculty. I think I did the same thing with students, right? I tried to create the same type of thing for students. And she's actually given us ideas that we can put into place right now. Page 68, I'm going to, where she talks about student evaluations, bias student evaluations. She gives them the playbook on the problem that student evaluations get. If you go to page 97, she goes on to give them more of a playbook. And she keeps giving these ideas about, let me turn to 97, creating higher benchmarks immediately before diverse candidates apply also suggests bias, employing both race and gender discrimination, right? It's this idea of the old guard, and I'll let you use that definition however you want to use the definition of the old guard, saying, well, this was the rule when I came on, but we're going to make the rule something different now, right? Like, if it didn't work back then, we'll change it up because y'all are getting in the door now. And so the idea of using the old tools in any way for a school that says they're trying to be different from the old way is essentially Andre Lord's idea of using the master's tools, right? And you're not going to see any difference. Yet we see schools going on and on about how they're different. They're chasing diversity. They're doing all these things, but they're doing it the exact same way that the old guard did to create what they have. And if you're somehow using the old guard tools and preaching about diversity, I would suggest, and this is Nancy Leong. If you don't know Professor Nancy Leong, look at Professor Nancy Leong's book. She's done a Harvard Law Review article called Racial Capitalism and a book called Identity Capitalism. That's what you're doing. You're saying all the right things because you want everybody to clap for you, but you're not, to use my term again, you're not acting because you're using the old guard's tools. And they're sitting there, I would suggest, laughing because, like, look, we don't even have to do it our way anymore. We've got you the picture, a personification, the person we want up on the screen, still using our same tools. And if we went into court and said, yes, Your Honor, I know the precedent says this, but I want that, what's going to happen in court? So why do you think it's going to be any different if in the practice of administrators and others, we use the same old tools and somehow think we're going to get some kind of different result? And if you're using those same tools and knowing you're not getting a result, if you have the data showing you're not going to see any change, yet you're still preaching the diversity thing, shame on you. For whatever institutions that are doing that, shame on you. Because that is the racial capitalism Nancy Long has talked about, she's written about, and you're engaging in. And if you know that, if you don't know it, that's one thing. But if you know it, shame on you. And there's nothing else that can be done to actually fix this, change this, modify it, because you're recreating it, reinforcing it, and reifying it by every act you do.
Can I just say one thing really quickly about the student part of this? You know, the vast majority of us in this space, Professor Jackson excluded, myself excluded, some of us excluded, don't actually have training in education itself. We don't have any training, we're just lawyers. And so one of the things that we really need to do is stop looking to people like us, people in the academy, in the legal academy, women of color in the legal academy, men of color in the legal academy, women in the legal academy, as models for what we should be doing for students. We are here in spite of all of the barriers that Professor Deo's book lays out. We are here in spite of everything that doesn't work. So if you build it for me, you haven't built it for students of color. If you build it for me, you haven't built it for women, because I was the student of color. I was the woman, one, who was relatively privileged within the system, but also was able to navigate a system that wasn't made for her. And so often we get together in a room with a bunch of people who figured out how to make it. And even the best of us with the best intentions, sometimes I'm like, I could do it. I could do it. And then I'm like, wait a minute. It's not for me. It's for the person who doesn't have every single luck that I had fall in my favor. And so we really, what do we do for students? We need to, one, acknowledge our lack of expertise in critically inclusive pedagogy, and then bring in students and bring in experts to help us. And then do what they say and stop pretending, as so many institutions do, that somehow law school is different. I know I've spent my entire time in the academy saying, this is what we should do. Oh, but that study is from K-12. That study is from undergrad. That study is from medical school, as if brains are different based on where you decided to go get educated. And so we need, as institutions, to drink a lot, or I guess eat a lot of humble pie, listen to our students, and give them some of the things that they ask for. Not the literal things that they always ask for, because sometimes those things don't align with what the research says they need, but they are telling us, right? They are telling us, stop ranking us. They are telling us, stop creating some myth around the law review genius. They are telling us things, and that is aligned with what the research says stops and hinders their achievement. And we're not doing that for students. Just like Professor Harris talked about all the ways we're not supporting the up and down the hierarchies of our teachers in the law school context, we're not supporting our students because we have a vision of what success looks like, and it looks like us. And we're not breaking out of that. I'm sorry I jumped in, but I wanted to make sure we said something about students.
Well, unfortunately, we have gone a little bit over our allotted time for this program today, and we want to be respectful of everyone's time. So we are going to wrap up, but I want to thank everyone for such a productive conversation. And hopefully this is a discussion that we as a legal community continue to have as we push for equity in all areas, including academic spaces. And I can speak for myself and the rest of Southwestern Law Review in thanking our panelists today. We are honored to have hosted such an accomplished array of scholars. and we are lucky to get the benefit of your insight and experience as we are on the precipice of our own legal careers. Thank you again to Professor Deo for your help with this event, and of course for your contribution of Unequal Profession, which was the impetus for this event, and the accompanying paper symposium, which will be published in the 51st volume of Southwestern's Law Review. And thank you so much to our attendees. We hope that this event was inspiring and thought-provoking, and we are glad that you could join us. And then one last housekeeping announcement, Lily will be jumping on to provide the link for those that would like CLE credit. And thank you for your participation in the chat. I saw that Dean Conway and some others posted their information in there, so be sure, you know, if you want to follow her on Twitter or anything, just thank you so much, everyone. I'm so happy that this went so well.
Link is in the chat, everyone, for CLE credit. It's a Google form. I'll also post my email in case anyone has questions or needs to chat about CLE. Thank you.
And I'll just echo everyone else's thanks, especially to the panelists, the organizers, and the participants. This is just the best day ever. I could do this all day, every day, and it means so much to me to hear your reflections on this work. So thank you. I know this is not the end of our conversation, and I look forward to talking with all of you more.